Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I'll just introduce our panelists today very quickly. Professor Todd Henderson is a professor of law at Chicago Law School. He's also an engineer, received his degree from Princeton University. And we have here today also Professor Luciano Chin, which is a professor of law and economics at Unicinos and FGV São Paulo. He was a visiting researcher at California, Berkeley, and a PhD from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Professor Eric Navarro is a federal judge since 2005. He's a vice president of the Law and Economics Brazilian Association, and he was a visiting researcher here at Harvard last year. He holds a PhD from the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. Last but not least, Luciana Jung is a professor of law and economics and director of the Center for Institutions and Business at INSPER São Paulo. She's a PhD in economics from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, São Paulo, and a master in applied economics from the University of Wisconsin. So without further ado, Professor Todd Henderson.
So thank you for inviting me. I am delighted to be here. I apologize that I don't speak Portuguese, but I'm grateful that you all speak English. After my last trip to Brazil, I tried to start learning to speak a little bit of Portuguese in the hopes that I would be invited back to Brazil by Luciano and get a chance to speak. And I found it to be too beautiful for me to even speak. I couldn't even, the words, I tried to form them, and it was just impossible for me. So I tried. Anyway, but I'm delighted to be here. I'm not an economist. I have no economics training at all. As he said in the introduction, I went to college to be an engineer, and then I went to law school because I thought that as a kid I wanted to be in the government. I wanted to be in policy. And the engineering was just some background for me and something my dad had done, so that's why I sort of was an engineer. So when I got to the University of Chicago Law School, I'd never even taken an economics course. And I found myself immersed in this world of law and economics, which the law school pioneered and is famous for. And I really had no idea what to expect. I thought maybe it involved math. I thought maybe it involved complicated formulas and regressions and only thinking about money. And of course, none of those things was true. The experience I had, 3 years as a student and then being a faculty member there for 10 years, was really transformative for me. It made me see the world in a completely new way, and a way that I think is a valuable analytical tool for thinking about social problems. And that's all law and economics is. It's just a tool for thinking about how you organize a society, which is what law is about. How can we encourage citizens in a society to act in ways that are beneficial for the society and for the individual? That's what law is about, directing people's conduct in socially regarding ways. And thinking about legal problems as an economist, it can be an effective way of doing that. To be clear, people equate when they hear the word economics, they think about dollar signs or reais. They think about money. And therefore, they think that anybody who is applying law and economics is only interested in maximizing the bottom line. How much, they imagine someone in American imagery, they imagine a big fat guy in a top hat with a cigar who's sort of sitting back, and there's, poor children who are toiling away making something, and he's cackling, how much money can I make? This could not be further from the truth. So the first thing I want to say is, if you look up at here and you see 5 people who practice the art of law and economics, it's not witchcraft. It is not about furthering some kind of anarcho-capitalist vision of society. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say is, and this is related what law and economics is about thinking of people's actions as motivated by the interest that that person has. That interest could be money, and for a lot of people, that is their primary motivation. Make as much money as possible. For a lot of other people, they might be trying to maximize, that's a word law and economics people use a lot, maximize something else like happiness. They might be interested in maximizing some social good that they think. I read about a Brazilian researcher who took as his mission to go into the Amazon, into Amazonia, and find the undisturbed, uncontacted tribes of Amazonia, and not actually find them, but kind of know where they are, and then prohibit people from going there. That guy was trying to maximize something. It was not his personal wealth. It might have been his reputation in the society. It might have been completely socially regarding. He might have been trying to maximize the welfare of these tribes or all of humanity. I have no idea. But he was trying to maximize something. And a way for law to think about that person is he's motivated by maximizing whatever he has as his end goal, and we should try to, if we're going to control his behavior, we need to understand what that person's trying to maximize and realize that we can use incentives, we can use rewards or punishments to direct that person in that way. So that's the second thing is we might be maximizing happiness, human welfare, the social good. Any of those things is something that can be put through a law and economics frame. Okay, a third point is when we think about something like incentives, human beings respond to incentives. This is something that we take for granted as people and as children. Luciano paid me $20,000 to be here today. No, he didn't pay me anything.
I wish.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I wish.
No, I respond to incentives. If Luciano is a great guy, which he is, when he asks me to come, I will come. If he gives me a bad experience when I'm in Brazil, then I may be less likely to come. We all know this with our children, if you have children. When I beat my children with a leather strap, when I beat my children, they learn not to do what they were doing to deserve the beating. And when I give them ice cream, they realize that they should be doing that. These are simple incentives.
Todd, may I just?
Yes, please.
What was the main good thing you did in Brazil? Was in some stadium of certain team?
Oh my God.
With the risk of alienating half of the audience, I will not say whether I'm a Gremio fan or not. People respond to incentives. This is a basic human principle, but something that when most law before the law and economics movement, American law did not think about this as a fundamental part of the design of legal rules. That human beings are designed to maximize their own well-being. You look out of the world, you try to maximize, you try to increase whatever it is that you are interested in the world. And again, that could be money, it could be happiness, it could be doing the social good. And as policymakers, realizing that that's the foundations of human behavior and thinking through what will this legal rule or this regulation, what effect will it have in terms of its consequences in the real world? an important, simple point. I'll give you, and I should say here, when law and economics builds what they call models, simple, if we do this, then we expect this thing to happen, it treats individuals as these kinds of purely self-interested maximizers. And again, the self-interest could be things that are, doing the best good for the world, but someone who's just solely interested in maximizing their own well-being. This, of course, does not describe reality. Life is much more complicated than a simple law and economics model. But these models are still very useful because they can predict actual real-world effects better than any other models. And I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, I had a physics class. Do you know physics, the study of mechanics and things like that? And we were taught, they would take a hill like this, and they would take something and they would take a Milky Way bar and you would slide it down like this. And we could describe the movement of this Milky Way bar with a formula. There's friction on the surface, there's a gravity, and so forth. Okay? This is simple Newtonian mechanics. It perfectly describes, and we can do it with math, how this Milky Way bar will fall down this slope. Okay? Newtonian mechanics is not true. It is not reality. Later, scientists realized that there's this thing called quantum mechanics that is much more complicated, infinitely more complicated, and that is the truth of the universe as best as we know it now. The movement of the atoms and electrons on the surface of this Milky Way bar are not described accurately by F equals ma or any other basic Newtonian formulas. And yet, despite the fact that our simple Isaac Newton formulas are just approximations, we have gone to the moon, we have built this building that's not going to fall down on us, we can look at real-world activities and predict them with good certainty, even though it's just a lie. It's just a shortcut that is not actually the world. And that's what law and economics is in a lot of cases. It does not, I can't look at this gentleman and say, okay, what is his function that describes how he will be motivated? It would be not capturing the complexity of his life and his situation with other people in the society. But if we just do an approximation, like Newtonian mechanics, we can predict the impact of legal rules on people in the entire society. And we can do it better than any other method that we know so far. Okay, let me give a kind of a simple example. Before law and economics revolution, we thought about crimes that happen in the society, through a kind of moral lens. There's a long tradition of this. The Bible talks about the things we shouldn't do, right? Don't murder people. There were lots of rules laid down from society that were passed down to us about what crimes were. And the idea about punishment, how much should we punish a crime, was based on maybe what we had done in the past. Maybe we used to hang people for theft, and then we thought, well, that's too much. We shouldn't hang people if they steal something. We shouldn't cut their hands off. So we started to come up with alternative methods. We would say, well, let's put people in jail. Let's take away their liberty. How long should we put people in jail? I don't know. How about 10 years? And this was based on, well, nothing, really. Just kind of our gut instinct. We would elect people and we'd send them to Brasilia, and they would sit in a room and they would say, how long should we put people who aren't our campaign contributors, how long should we put them in jail? And they might hear testimony. They might have The victims of crimes come in and tell them, this person killed someone in my family. It's very terrible. And so they would feel very terrible, and they would think, my emotions are moved. We need to send a signal to the world that this is a bad thing. Okay. An economist would think about this, someone who does a lot of economics would think about this a little bit differently. They would say to themselves, okay, what is the social cost of the conduct that we are trying to prohibit? And try to calculate in sort of crude terms what the impact of this is on society. Not just the real dollar costs, of course, that's a factor, but also emotional costs of people. How does it make people feel? And then think so it's sort of like, what is the cost of crime? Does it make people react and try to protect themselves from crime? That's a cost of crime. If I have to install a burglar alarm in my house, that's a cost that I'm bearing from criminal activity. The real losses, the value of life, the value of property stolen, the people who don't engage in voluntary transactions because things are being stolen. Because after all, from some point, if I steal this Milky Way bar from my friend here, society is no worse off. He had a Milky Way bar, I have a Milky Way bar. He's been harmed, and the amount he's been harmed, I've been gained in exactly the same amount. So in that sense, why should we prohibit me from stealing this Milky Way bar from him? In terms of the total society, there's been no harm. The reason that we want to prevent me from stealing this from him is not because some moral reason like he deserves the Milky Way bar or something like that. It's because if I can just steal his Milky Way bar, I will engage in theft as opposed to buying it from him. He will know that I will be stealing from him, and then he will engage in spending resources to protect against me stealing from him, right? He will put little cameras on his cup to watch to make sure someone's stealing his Milky Way bar. He will live behind big fences in his house in Rio de Janeiro. He will install cameras. He will have security guards. These expenditures on real resources are the social cost of crime, not some moral view that he had it and now I have it. This doesn't matter at all at one level, right? It's the I'm going to protect against you stealing, which is the real cost of crime. We want to encourage voluntary transactions because we think that voluntary transactions are superior to coerced transactions. Now, I should note here, taxation is a form of theft. And some other people take my money against my will. And if I don't pay the taxes, they will put me in jail, right? There's a famous line in America, your money or your life. And that is the deal the government has given us. Give me your money or we'll put you in prison. Now, why is that coerced transaction okay? Well, the story about taxation is that rich people value money less than poor people. Why would rich people value money less than poor people? After all, they've spent a long time making all the money. Well, $1 to me delivers me a lot less value, a lot less, economists would call it utility. This is sort of like happiness, value, all the things I can do with $1. It is much less valuable to me than someone who's very poor. So Luciano's very rich, I'm very poor. One more dollar for him, yes, he can buy another ticket to see Gremio, but I'm very poor. $1 for me means I might be able to eat a meal and survive. That difference, what economists call marginal utility, how much every additional dollar is values to him versus me, that difference is what justifies stealing from him, taxes, to give them to me. It's a theft that we're all okay with. Even I, a person who believes in a relatively small government, am okay with taxes on this basis. However, we should characterize it as theft and be clear that that theft of his money paying to me is only justified if it actually makes me better off and him better off. That's the only justification. In my stealing of the candy bar, in this situation, two relatively well-off people, it doesn't make me better off. If I'm starving to death and it's the choice between this and dying, then maybe the calculation might be different. Maybe, maybe not. If you've seen Les Mis, you may, Les Miserables, the play, the Victor Hugo play, you might have a view about that. Okay, so back to the crime example. I should wrap up, I guess. How would an economist think about punishment? Well, the economist thinks about punishment in the law and economics person thinks about punishment in the following way. Why does a criminal engage in punishment in crime? That's the first question to ask. If you are a moralist, you might say, well, they're just a bad person. And we just want to discourage bad people, and there's something wrong with that person. Someone in law and economics thinks of a criminal as a maximizer of their utility, just like everybody else. And the criminal looks at the situation and says, well, if I steal this Milky Way bar, I will be better off by 1. And the 1 could be dollars, hunger points, happiness, whatever it is. I'll be better off by 1 unit if I steal this Milky Way bar. But then, if I was going to steal it, I would think to myself, well, what happens if I get caught? The benefit to me is 1. If I get caught stealing this Milky Way bar, it's very unlikely the police are going to be called. But my friend might not be very happy with me. And my reputation in Brazilian law and economics circles, they're very elite and very prestigious circles, they would suffer. And I wouldn't be invited back. I wouldn't be invited to the beach in September for the conference this year, which I'm very much looking forward to. That is the cost of crime. So there's a benefit and there's a cost. And the law and economics model predicts that criminals will engage in crime where the benefits exceed the costs. Very simple. Okay, if you think about this in the context of crime in society, I'm thinking about robbing a bank. I could use the money. There's a bank right down the street. I could walk in. I could put my hand in my jacket and pretend I have a pistol. And I could say, please give me the money behind the cash. And will I rob the bank today before I leave for Chicago? No, I won't. Okay, why will I not rob the bank? Well, one thing is I would have to do a calculation of how much I would expect to get. Maybe I get $10,000 and I get away. Then what's the cost to me? Well, the first thing I want to know is, what is the chance that I get caught? If I think that I'm going to be caught with, let's say, a 50% chance, so there's a 50% chance I will get away from it. That's the first fact I need to know. And the second fact I need to know is, what is the punishment going to be if I get caught? So I'm going to spend 10 years in jail. I'll have to give back my $10,000 I stole, and I'll be fired from my job. My wife will divorce me, and my friends will never speak to me again. Okay, so on the benefit side, I get $10,000. On the cost side, I get no job, 10 years in jail, give back the money, and I lose my life as I know it. And I multiply that times 50%. And if 50% times all that punishment is less than $10,000, then we can predict that I will rob that bank. Maybe not me today. I got to get back to home. But, and I haven't scouted out the bank yet. But in general, the punishment for robbing banks should be set so that what an economist called the expected value. How much is a bank robbery worth to you before you know whether you're going to get caught or not? So imagine that the two cases, you're engaged in some kind of criminal activity. You're, I don't know, let's say you're bribing judges, for instance. How much should we set the penalty? Well, one thing I would want to know is, are you very likely to catch the people who are engaging in political corruption? If you are for sure going to catch them, so imagine a case where every corruption case is caught with certainty. So the probability of detection and arrest is 100%. We catch them all. And then imagine a case, a country, a society, a city, where you only have about a 10% chance of catching the corruption. In those two different worlds, so let's say in Massachusetts, they have a very good police department, they have a very good monitors of people, and they will catch the criminals 100% of the time. And in Illinois, where I live, the police aren't so good, the system doesn't work very well, and will only catch them 10% of the time. The claim of law and economics is that the punishment in Massachusetts should be much lower than the punishment in Illinois. Because for the criminals thinking about engaging in crime, if I know I'm going to be caught, let's say the benefit of a crime is 5 units, okay, and the punishment is 10 units. So the crime gets you 5, the punishment is 10. Nobody will engage in this crime if they know they're going to be caught, because they're going to get 5 for certain in the crime, they know they're going to be caught, and they know they're going to suffer 10. There will be no crime. No rational person would commit a crime to gain 5 if they knew they were going to suffer 10. If I was going to steal the Milky Way, I knew I was going to be caught, and the punishment for stealing Milky Ways was $10, I would never steal the Milky Way. I would go out to the concession stand and buy one for $1. If the punishment, however, is only going to be meted out, is only going to be felt by the criminal 10% of the time, if the gain is 5 and the punishment is only 10, what does the criminal expect when they're doing their cost-benefit calculation? A punishment of 10% of the time, I expect to be punished 1 unit. Because 9 times out of 10, I don't get any punishment. And I don't know whether I'm going to be punished or not, so it's just a probability. And the probability of being caught times the punishment is what I think I'm going to be punished. So in a world in which the benefit of a crime is 5 and the punishment is 10, we don't know whether the criminals will engage in the conduct. It depends on how likely they are to get caught and prosecuted. So if you live in Illinois and you know the penalty is 10 and the probability of detection is only 10%, and you're a legislature, what do you need to do? You need to raise the penalty. You need to raise the penalty to at least 51, because 51 times 10% is 5.1, and that's greater than 5, which is the average penalty. Now, people might respond, and this is where I'll wrap up, people might respond and say, this isn't how criminals think. They don't engage in this kind of calculation, okay? My first response to that is back to my analogy to quantum mechanics. It may not be the case that one individual deciding whether to rob a bank thinks exactly like this. Someone might be desperate. They might not sit down and coldly calculate what the probability of detection is. That's not generally how we think people behave. However, I will say with high confidence that if we look at a state like Illinois and we see that the probability of detection and prosecution is lower for a given penalty, we will see more crime. That is, in the bulk of cases, people will respond to the incentives the system creates, even if they're not doing this cold calculation individually. If we raise the punishment, and on the other side of things, if the punishment is too high, that let's say the benefit of a crime is 5, and we set the penalty at 100 with a probability of detection of 0.1, the expected harm for the criminal is 10 units, that's way too high. We're punishing people too much. The jails are full of too many people because we don't need to be punishing people that severely to deter them from doing the crime. And that's what the criminal law is about, deterring people from stealing and encouraging them to engage in voluntary transactions. The other thing is there's lots of evidence that criminals do engage in this kind of analysis. Criminals know more about the criminal law than law professors do. They get that knowledge not from big red books or reading the Supreme Court cases, but from what a famous economist called F.A. Hayek called local knowledge. They talk to their friends. They experience, oh, I have a friend who robbed a bank. They caught him in 20 minutes. Therefore, I'm updating the chance that I'm going to be caught robbing a bank. So, I have 20 friends in jail. If you have 20 friends in jail, you know the punishments that are actually meted out by the justice system better than my colleagues who sit there and teach criminal justice at the law school. So the actual knowledge of people in these situations, I think, is a lot higher than we expect. But in any event, the point is that people will respond to these incentives, and in designing the optimal criminal law, the goal of the society is to deter people from stealing or whatever the crime is at the lowest possible cost. The lowest possible personal cost to people you send to jail who are taken away from their families, who have to have their liberty taken away from them. The lowest possible cost to society to get people to engage in behavior that is socially regarding. And we could read Aquinas or some famous Brazilian moral theory about criminal law and how much punishment there should be and the righteous, and we could look to the Bible. I think those things are likely to not help us very much to design a system that gets people deterred from crime at the lowest possible social cost. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think this was the clearest introduction to law and economics I've ever heard. So now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Luciane Jung, who's presenting a slideshow here.
I'm gaming. It's not true.
I feel bad.
Não atrapalha não, só você fica sentado.
Não, vai atrapalhar sim, tá vendo? Se não der, eu sento ali, não tem problema.
Quer ajuda?
Ah, tá. Okay, let me go to that way. Yeah, it's working. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I'm very glad to be here today and be with my friends, Luciano, Eric, Professor Todd. And I'd like to thank so much Bruno for the invitation and congratulate the organizing committee. Today, as my contribution to this panel, I would like to share with you some findings that I had in some close to 10 years of doing research. I selected 4 pieces of research, and I think that this is very much into what Professor Todd just presented, to have economics as a tool and not as an end, right? So these are all examples of how we can use economic lens to see legal problems, right? So I selected 4 pieces of research that I have been doing, some by myself and some with co-authors. And when I was preparing to this presentation, I just realized that actually these are 4 themes all related to the judiciary, but somehow with totally different methodologies. This was just by chance. So those of you who are engaged in academic research, probably this is some ideas that you might get, to apply some economic tools to study the judiciary as a whole. Okay. So I'll start with the very beginning. At that time, I can say that I was a pure economist, right? I didn't have that much study and research in law. And I actually, at that time, differently to, I think that most what law and economics researchers do, economics was the end, was not means. And that was like 10 years ago. So as an economist, actually, what really concerned me about law, about the legal system, about the judiciary, are the implications that it had on economic performance. So what really matters to most of the pure economists that I say is efficiency. So inefficient courts, inefficient legal system have negative impacts on economic performance. This is what I was worried about at the beginning. And when I went on with some research, I saw that actually this is a very common question that most researchers that deals in economics and the judiciary would have. And actually there is a pretty lengthy literature on this topic. Many of them studying and analyzing what were the causes of inefficiency, and some of them trying to measure that. And in this process, in trying to measure, I found out one interesting methodology, which is not that much common in economics, which is called DEA, Data Involvement Analysis. So what DEA does is actually look at a set of observations, a set of units. Those could be, either factories, could be either stores, bank agencies, or could also be schools, could also be hospitals, and why not courts. And DEA would go look at a sample of courts, for instance, and then identify those which are the most efficient ones within this group. So following the steps of some other scholars, I did the same for Brazil. In my first research, I looked at the years 2006 to 2008, and then I applied them to the state courts in Brazil, the 27 state courts in Brazil. So in the DEA definition, the most efficient ones within these groups are those lying on the frontier, the so-called efficient frontier. And for these 3 periods, the 2 state courts will appear on the frontier with a perfect score of 1.000, which actually means 100% of efficiency within the group, where the state courts are Rio de Janeiro and Rio Grande do Sul. The farther you are from the efficiency frontier, the smaller the number is, the more inefficient you are. So we can see that there are actually some courts that are very inefficient, right? That was 10 years ago. I resumed this research very recently, and now I gather 7 more years, so I have a panel now, a total of 10 years, right? And then there's something, except the year 2009, I think that all the remaining results are pretty coherent. So there's something wrong that I don't know what exactly is. I have to go look at the raw numbers. But again, I don't know if that was a surprise or not, but Rio Grande do Sul and Rio de Janeiro, again, except for 2009, they remained also the most efficient within this group. So this is actually a more static analysis of the situation. Because we have now a lengthier period of time, I could go a step further with the DEA analysis and get the Malmquist index. What this index does is actually to split the idea of efficiency and more exactly of productivity into different indicators. One related to technical efficiency, one related to technological efficiency, one related to scale of economies efficiency, and then summing them all, we have what is called the TFB, the total factor productivity, the last column here. The last column here. TFP is a very important economic concept The total factor productivity is an idea that shows how, for instance, a whole economy moves on, evolve in terms of productivity. So there have been all these macroeconomists will study, whether the whole Brazilian economy have evolved in terms of TFP during 30 years, during 50 years, during one whole century. So to my surprise, and it was a negative surprise, only 3 state courts had positive growth during this period for all these scales here. Technical efficiency, technological efficiency, scale economy efficiency, and TFP. So these were the state courts of Amapá and Tocantins, which the Brazilians know are very small states and small courts. So it's not a surprise that they had positive growth. But only Rio de Janeiro, again, had positive numbers in all of these indicators. I have the whole table. I will not present to you guys here today. But what we can summarize about Brazil. What's wrong? I cannot move now. Okay. So as a summary for the situation in Brazil for all the 27 state courts, we see that on average for each of these years from 2009 to 2010, we have an average growth of 1.7 in total factor productivity change. So this is the whole index. Positive growth also for the technical efficiency of 2.4 per year in average. But technical change and scale efficiency change were all negative for Brazil as a whole. Okay, so this somehow is a little bit worrisome. I will not discuss about the results here today, but just to food for thoughts for us, especially because we know there have been some kind of implementation of efficiency boosting by the judiciary recently. So probably these are some very good food for thoughts and for further policy implications in the near future. I think that we still have something to see and to learn about. The second research that I wanted to talk about here today is about judicial quality. So when I started doing my research with efficiency, lawyers and even judges would say, oh, you're an economist, you only care about efficiency. You know that sometimes there's some kind of trade-off between efficiency and quality. The problem is that quality is really hard to define. It's a very difficult concept, especially judicial quality. Probably something close to it would be bias, negative quality. Nobody likes biased decision. Right? But even though bias is also difficult to work with, although there are already people working that on the literature. And actually, when we talk about bias, when we try to measure bias somehow, we are actually trying to measure tendencies. Tendencies in decisions made by a particular judge or a particular court or a particular justice, right? So just to make sure what we are talking about when we talk about bias, this actually we're talking about tendencies. Just to put the context, this is not a new story. In Brazil, we talk about a lot about biased decision, and there are some kind of anecdotal evidence, and even 3 very famous economists, Pécio Arida, Edmar Baixo, André Lara Rezende, the guys who created the Plano Real. And they mentioned in a particular publication here in the United States that enforcement of guarantees, basically contracts in Brazil, is poor because both the law and the jurisprudence are biased toward the debtor. This affirmation did not surprise me. What surprised me is actually that these 3 very smart guys, they simply said that without any consideration of providing empirical corroboration of this. So they simply stated that without showing any numbers and any kind of corroboration. So I grabbed this challenge for myself and I tried to do that. That was also a couple of years ago, and that time there was no big data, which I'm going to talk in a while. And then I spent 1 year collecting decisions made by the STJ, the Superior Court for civil cases, for those who don't know. And basically, I got a set of close to 1,700 cases. And then for this particular research, I ended up with 950 cases. So this is a very traditional econometric model. This is the most traditional way of doing economic empirical analysis. And basically, for those of you who are not very familiar with that, we have one question here. So whether the decisions were biased somehow. Remember, this is how we are defining bias, right, by STJ. And we are trying to see a set of variables or factors that somehow might cause. This is a causality relationship, okay? So we want to see whether any of these, of all of them, have any kind of causality impacts, but in the fact that, you know, the decision is biased or not. I just wanted to discuss two responses, two results here today. So, you know, STJ is the superior court. It basically receives appeals from all over the country, from the state courts, from the lower courts, all over the country. And then when we look particularly to those cases coming from the state of São Paulo, we indeed see that there is 13.2% of chances that STJ will decide in favor of the debtor. And this result, because it has some stars in here, the stars mean that these results are not by chance, they are not random. They have 5% of statistical significance, meaning that there's only 5% of chances that this is random, right? So this is the first result that appeared to be significant in showing that, yes, there is something, you know, causing the decisions to be in favor of debtors. These are all cases of breaches of contracts with financial institutions, okay? So we always have financial institution in one side. The second result are those cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul. Now we have an opposite causality. The cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul, whenever they reach STJ, they will also have 9.3% of chances to be decided not in favor of the debtor. This is what this small negative sign here shows, right? Negative, so it means the other direction. So the story here is that cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul, they have chances of being decided against debtors by STJ. Using the same sample, I asked the second question. The second question was whether the justices at STJ did amend the cases decided by lower courts. So my question was whether they changed these decisions. Again, and now I just wanted to share one result. Rio Grande do Sul appeared again as a special case, a case with statistical significance. And guess what? Cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul, they have 14% of chances to be amended by STJ. This is huge, right? If we sum up the results from these two previous tables, we have a short story here, specifically for Luciano State, Rio Grande do Sul. There's always some story about that, right? So first, cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul, whenever they reach STJ, they have the highest chance among all other states to be amended by STJ. And in which direction? In the direction against debtors. So I just want again to offer you some food for thought. Probably there are some kind of indications of bias, either by STJ with regards to cases coming from Rio Grande do Sul, or by the judges at Rio Grande do Sul themselves, right? The story I try to tell in my paper is that there seems to be some kind of bias within the state court at Rio Grande do Sul, and that STJ, the justice at STJ, tries somehow to correct that by these significant chances of amending it. But I will leave that for you to think about. So let's move on. The third piece of research I wanted to show you is a different one, is a very different story. But again, using this economic lens to try to understand the legal environment. And now the question is about the role of Supreme Courts. Actually, there is a lengthy literature on this, especially abroad, either for common law countries or for civil law countries. And basically, we want to understand what is the role of Supreme Court in the case of STF, mostly in giving some kind of stability and harmonization of decisions made by lower courts. Are decisions made by STF real good signals for lower courts or not. I and my three co-authors for this paper, we chose a topic which is a very sensitive one, a very complex problem, most Brazilians probably know about, related to land conflicts between rural producers and indigenous people. So in 2009, there was this historical decision by STF in the case related to the so-called region of Raposo Serra do Sol, exactly a conflict between producers, rural producers, and indigenous people. Actually, for our research, it really doesn't matter what the final decision was, but just for you to know, the decision basically favored the indigenous people, the reservation for the indigenous people, and the rural producer had somehow, to accept their land being split in several different areas. But our question actually was whether this decision in 2009 have consolidated conflicts in lower courts. For this particular research, we used a very particular and very atypical methodology called QCA, Qualitative Comparative Analysis. Actually, I've never seen any economist using this kind of methodology. And probably this is the reason why we are having some troubles to publish this paper. But it is very applied in political science and somehow in business too. So now we are not using causal relationships to explain the story, right? We are not looking at variables that cause a particular ending. Actually, QCA is an algorithm that will try to identify what it calls paths, or actually these paths are combinations of variables, combinations of factors that will, predict some kind of outcome, or final outcome. The outcome that we are actually interested here is to see, decisions being made by lower courts which are in favor of rural producers. We could have chosen the outcome of decisions in favor of indigenous people. That would be closely the same thing. But we just, for some reason, we decided to look at the outcome decisions favoring producers. And the result here is something like this. What we did actually is to split our sample into two subsamples. Those cases coming and decided before Raposo Serra do Sol, and those cases decided after Raposo Serra do Sol, to see whether there was any kind of impact in this second group here. What can I summarize from our findings is that before Raposo Serra do Sol, there were two paths or two combinations of factors. Actually, each of these lines here are some factors, right? And there was two very clear paths leading to this outcome of decisions being pro-farmers. After 2009, however, you can see that actually there are 6 paths. So what it means is that actually the story now is much less coherent than before. It is much harder to understand what actually drives a particular, decision to be pro-farmer. So if you could summarize somehow this result is that although Raposo Serra do Sol was a very important case, a very historical case, it was broadcasted everywhere in Brazil and even abroad, actually it did not consolidate the jurisprudence over these land conflicts. What it did, it ended up in more erratic and less coherent and more divergent, less harmonizations in the manner that judges in lower courts interpreted situations that were very similar to this. So in the end of the story, our answer was no. At least for this case, it did not show, the STF decision did not present us any kind of harmonization. This is kind of in line with what the literature shows. There are certain and important conditions under which Supreme Court decisions do really have some harmonization and coherent path, providing coherent paths to lower courts. And we didn't see that here in our research, particularly at this team. Finally, just to close my presentation, this is still a very preliminary research with other 2 colleagues of mine. We are using, again, a new methodology in looking for a very old problem, labor courts in Brazil. Our database is, we are focusing now in the TRT2, which is the labor court for the region of São Paulo, from the decisions made from 2001 to 2017. And now, for the first time, I'm fully engaging in text mining, big data available for this study. So in the end, for now, we have close to 130,000 cases, and this is the great advantage of working with big data. I really encourage people to do so because, as I said, for my second piece of research, I spent 10 months working from Monday to Friday, grabbing the judgments for STJ, and I just got 1,700. And in 3 months, we got actually 300,000. And after some cleaning, the cleaning is the hardest process, we ended up with this sample of 100 and close to 130,000. As I said, this is still a very preliminary research. We're still working on that. But what we already found out, some interesting results. All these cases that were actually initiated by employees against their employers, their companies, and in only 11.45% of cases, these employees had a complete failure in the decision, right? So the decision was totally 100% against the demands, the employees' demands. Only in 11.45% of cases, employers, the companies got success, right? I don't want to go into the normative derivations of this result. We can talk about that later, about what really is behind these numbers, and this is actually where we are moving towards in our research. Another interesting result is the average value of conviction, 28,500 reais. I myself consider this number quite big for such a big sample, and as an average number. There's a lot of diversity. There are some smaller numbers and some very big numbers, but even though I think that the average value was pretty high. And then another interesting result is that from these 130,000 closely, in 77.31%, there was this demand for acesso gratuito à justiça, right? So not having to pay the fees by the employees. And actually, in every time that you ask for that, you get it, 99.63%, right? So I don't know who are the silly people who don't ask for that, right? So these are the very preliminary results. Just to wrap up, I think that we are just starting to learn how does the judiciary work, at least in an empirical manner, in a scientific manner. As I just said, these are 4 types of possible research methodologies, but there are just so many, and every year you have new methodologies. So I really encourage you all, and there's just so many things to study. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Luciana. She's, as you could see, one of the most important experts in empirical research of the judiciary in Brazil. And I'm happy that this kind of research is growing up fast because we have very good data from the Brazilian judiciary. And actually, we have here Henrik Ziegstad, who is a PhD student in economics here at Harvard, who's studying the Brazilian judiciary. So maybe you guys can work together in something. So Henrik is going to Brazil this year to gather data and see in practice how things work. So our next panelist is going to be Luciano Chin, who will present his slideshow here.
Posso falar daqui com a Luciana? So good morning, everybody. It's great pleasure to be here among friends of law and economics community, and especially judges federal judges from Brazil. I have been discussing law and economics with judges in Brazil for quite a while, and I even have my president of our association right in front of us, Professor Orlando, who is going to hold the conference in Florianopolis. We have the association for 10 years. It's going to be the 11th meeting. And we're thrilled to, we're going to have Todd, we're going to have Luciana there, probably Marcelo, who is also a visiting scholar here, Bruno, and Eric, who's not here anymore. So the idea was to, and I will try to summarize because I had a few things to share with you, but I think part of what I had to say was already covered by Todd and by Luciana in a way. I became a lawyer more or less in the same way as Todd. So my parents were economists, and I got into the economics school because they were economists, and I thought that I should be as well. But then I took economics at the same time as law, and I realized that after learning economics, that I should continue with the law profession. And at that time, because there was so many jobs for economists. For lawyers in Brazil, there's always, job. So all my academic career is related to law. So my master PhD is within the realm of law. But I like to partner with economists because they give us a scientific methodology so that we can assess things rather than discussing in a bar. That I have the impression that nowadays people pose their ideas like in a bar. What I feel like, is more, more legally justice or not, fair or not. So one of the researches I conduct was for the National Council of Justice, the CNJ. CNJ was interested and made a bid to understand why we had so many cases, civil cases, in state courts in Brazil. You're going to say, oh, but we're federal. What's our interest? I mean, because I will say to you that the reason why we have so many cases in state courts is more or less why we have so many cases in labor courts, federal courts. So we team with economists in this project, the law school, of course, business school, and the sociology school. The economics school did something more or less like Luciana explained. It compares the efficiency of state courts. And why compare efficiency of state courts? Because if there are some courts more efficient than others, and it seems to be that in our research, Rio did a good job, the state court, as well as Rio Grande do Sul, it means that other courts, less efficient courts, could increase their efficiency and provide, in terms of supply of justice system, more access to people without expending more money. That's the whole idea of improving efficiency. So when we found that difference between efficiency of state courts, we made some proposals how to enhance efficiency of some courts, like trying to put CNJ to cooperate and create incentives for less efficient courts become more efficient than others. But I think it's more interesting to share with you what the sociologists found about why people litigate in Brazil. And we did that research. And people litigate in Brazil and it can be easily explained by law and economics. Our intuition before we went through the research was, if there are too many cases, if the courts are flooded, that's because there's an overconsumption of the judicial system by the parties. And why is that? If microeconomics is correct, and, and it is, as physics is when the plane goes up, you know, that's because it's not enough costly. I mean, if people use a lot assistência judiciária gratuita, they will litigate a lot because it's for free. It's like going to a casino, but the coins you receive for free. You don't pay for that casino. And we did empirical work, and that's what we found. So let me, we basically, as I explained, we compared the efficiency in order to improve or try to improve the efficiency of less efficient courts. We identify motivations to litigate. Business school people, they assess how courts manage cases because there's a serious problem of management. Federal courts are not that bad in terms of management of cases, but state courts are really, the business school people, they're really stunned by the lack of use of minimum aspects of management. And then we suggested some strategies. Some of them actually were incorporated in our the new procedural civil code, but the main one, which is the free access to justice, was not corrected yet, and that's why, in my belief at least, that's why we have we have so many cases. Luciana gave the example of labor courts, like 99% of people would receive AJG, and in state courts would be like 70, sometimes 80, and people wonder why there are so many cases, you know. We started from some premises that Todd explained, that people that go to court, oddly enough, they're rational. You know, they're rational. They're bounded rational. Their rationality is not perfect, Todd explained, but they're rational. They bring a case after doing some level of research. Can I bring this lawsuit? They ask to the lawyer, how much would it cost? How long it would take? People pose these questions. People react to incentives. So if the jurisprudence give a JG, free access to everybody, guess what? People get in court. People are self-interest. Not only the parties are self-interest, lawyers are self-interest. And they might file lawsuits for their own interest. That's what we call in law and economics agency problem, you know. Judges are interested judges. Eric had his PhD. I was in the jury, you know, at UERJ, and he explained a little bit. Yes, judges can be also, as professors, can be self-interest people. Of course, everybody has their own utility curve, but everybody has one. And institutions matter, create a sort of set of incentives that people respond, and judicial precedent creates what's called, used to say, second-order effects. So the Supreme Court not only judge a case, but create incentives for another case, and how, you know, if a JG is given to everybody, so people think there is an incentive to ask for that. Try to refuse a JG, and you will realize that people start going to the court, at least when they don't have a right, and I'm going to explain that. Another thing we had as a premise was that behind rights there are interests. So what moves people is not rights. What moves people are interests. They might go to court not to pay a debt, for instance. They might go to court to get a settlement. So there's a lot of reasons why people go to court, but right is not the major thing at stake, oddly enough. When we pose this research to the CNJ, the justice said, oh, professor, we don't need that research. We know already why people go to court. And I said, oh, yeah? Yeah, like any procedural law book says that one goes to court because of a right. I said, well, that's what I want to research in practice. and let me find out. And then they finally gave us this chance. So we did a sociological analysis of motivations. It was very important to have sociologists because if you only have economists, they will say, "Oh, that's a bunch of neoliberals doing something for the World Bank." No, it was for CNJ. We have sociologists, even sociologists that were doing empirical work for MST, with MST, so there was no ideological agenda, hidden agenda. We're not fighting against Brazil or the justice system or whatever. And the business school. Let me, I'm going to skip when we do this assessment of efficiency, is basically compare what the justice costs, justice system costs, and what it delivers in terms of outputs, awards. Well, Luciano, I think it's unfair to do that, but honestly, if we can assess, and be careful because efficiency is not profit. There's a great confusion. Well, you talk about efficiency, but the hospital in poor area, even the hospital in poor area should and must be efficient. It doesn't mean that it's profit. Profit is an accountancy concept. Efficiency is an economic, which means giving the best allocation for that resource. That is what, so even a hospital, a school can be assessed in terms of efficiency and judiciary as well. The management school found out serious problems of management, absence of standardized and documented procedures for the routine task, lack of qualification of employees, not the judges, but the people who actually is in charge with management of cases, lack of a career. So management people realize that everybody who works for a judge has a book to pass on the exam. So nobody is there to really be in that position. So that's why we suggest to create a management career for the legal system, for the judiciary system. But let me, problems with infrastructure, music, several problems that they realize. So, but let me get to what is the most interesting thing for you. We found basically, and that was interesting, the best people to conduct empirical work would be economists or sociologists, because when lawyers get involved with empirical work, people get afraid. I don't know why people are afraid of lawyers. So you call the judge and say, "Hey, judge," remember, a judge, of course, in Porto Alegre, I know the judges, but let's say you call them, "Okay, judge, hello, my name is Luciano, I'm a lawyer, and I'm conducting a survey." No, what do you want from me, you know? That's always this question from lawyers, what do you want from me, you know? Or you call a party and you want to interview them because we want to understand why people are litigating. So we needed to, you know, interview them. A lawyer, what do you want from me? So when the sociologist calls means, you know, very relaxed people, a scientist, not a lawyer. So we ended up exploring more the the sociologists here. So we basically find out 4 motivations to access courts, and we don't refuse that access to courts is important in a democratic system, but the problem is to have people that is there, but they shouldn't be there because they are making the courts loaded of work, and people who has the right, people that have the right, they don't have the real access to justice. So first, and it's not in terms of, it's not put here in terms of importance or statistics, but the 4 motivations, and it's a qualitative method that sociologists use, and I found out very interesting, that you really interview the party in 1 hour and 30 minutes, more or less, and a PhD professor would do that, the same person, or his team. So the first one was low access costs, which means cost fees. People, we interview a lot of people. People think that is cheap. Actually, it's free to go to court. So why then don't go, you know? And the risk is very low. Because why the risk is low? Because if I have free justice, I don't pay for the other party's fees, what we call sucumbência. Because if I have AJG, I don't pay sucumbência. Then, again, it's a casino for free. And that's what we find out in interviews. The people say, well, legal system in Brazil is a casino. I get the coins and I bet, and if it's a good bet, then I made my, call it a day, you know. Another perspective was earning perspective. People go to court sometimes because they want to make some money out of it. So I give this the paradigm of my cousin. She every time she travels now, she's happy when there's a problem with her luggage because she knows it's 5,000 reais. So she knows that when a luggage is, you know, lost, and she even carries her own luggage to, you know, to avoid any problem. But then, whoo, thanks God, the airline lost my luggage, then $5,000. And she did that for 3 times already. I said to her, well, next time I'm not going to sue for you. But somebody will do, you know, in a country with 1 million lawyers, somebody will do. And because that's what I see sometimes. The judges criticize lawyers, but judges are the one who gives the rights. And that's why if they had refused, people wouldn't be there. Because the judicial system is the one that creates the precedents that lawyers respond. So it's a kind of game that everybody, I think judges are in the position to cut that. Lawyers, their economic engine, they just respond to the incentives. And I'm not a big litigation attorney, that's why I can say that. So instrumental use, so people go to court not to have access to justice with J, capital letter, but to have something, to gain time, to get a settlement, but not to have the award. So all these 3 kinds of people, they're not someone who could be described by the famous philosopher Dworkin, who criticized Posner, because they want to have justice. That's really instrumental people that make cost-benefit analysis and they find out it's good to go for trial. And then, yes, we have people who suffer injury, and these people, they really want a judicial war. It doesn't matter if it's $1, and we interview people who lost their relatives in, for instance, plane crash. These people, some of them might want settlement, but most of the people, they just have morally, they want to see someone convicted. And I could go on. We have parts of interviews. It's great. And so parties say, oh, there's no upfront cost. It does not cost a try. I think the cost is directly proportional, especially if we see the lawsuit as from a business perspective. There's always cost-benefit analysis. Of course, when there is an individual party, that cost-benefit analysis is not so sophisticated, but when there's a company, they really analyze the suit carefully. I could go on and the earning perspective, oh, I lost some time, so, you know, I'm going to file a claim. Then I can benefit it. Or people commented, no, I'm finished, yeah. Well, you know, some people made this comment, so they made some money, I'm going to sue them. We have the perspective of a lawyer, the instrumental use. People do not seek justice for justice. They see as an element of negotiation. How do you feel about that, being, you know, a judge that received those cases, and there are a lot of people thinking that's their real interest in filing a suit. As case takes long time, parties often use judiciary to delay the fulfillment of their obligations. The injury, well, that's when we find real concern. The main proposal we did, and I will finish that up, is related to AJG. AJG, free access, should be given to poor people. And what is poor? And then economists gave us a suggestion. Poor is, according to some index, let me see if I follow, a family, that's the IBGE bar, cases of family income around 2 minimum wages. That is a poor person, and that's when I was at PUC, the service aid, we would only take poor people, which would mean 2 minimum wages per month. Other than that, people are not poor and they should pay. I was, and a second suggestion was made by my former colleague from the master's program at Federal University Justice Teori Zavascki, he suggested that poor people is those who does not pay tax. So unless if you're paying tax, you're not poor. So you should pay the courts. And it's not because it's the 200 reais, it's to take the risk of paying the sucumbência. That's what makes people think about filing a suit. And don't wonder why. People who does not study law and economics are surprised by the results of the reform of the labor law. They just pass, I'm not sure if you're aware, but they just pass some changes in labor procedure. And they find out that now the people should pay it. And there's a criteria for having a JG, the amount of case decreasing 40%. Of course, it's gonna. Of course, maybe it's not going to be like that, but people start wondering, and they do some calculation before they file a lawsuit. So I think that is the contribution that so either you can use your association to try to make the Congress pass a law in which there's a clear criteria of who is poor, or you can create a jurisprudence, because the jurisprudence, according to Luciana showed for another subject, we did the research for a JG. It's people making 10,000 reais per month is poor and receiving. Companies are receiving a JG. It's a completely, honestly, schizophrenia. With that, I end my comments and pass to my next colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Luciano, who has been in this battle of advancing the study of law and economics in Brazil for more than a decade, right?
Yeah.
And now we don't want to preach to the converted anymore. We want to get more people to know and to understand the importance of the study of law and economics in Brazil. And we're glad to have all you guys here attending this symposium. So next speaker is Eric Navarro, who has around 15-20 minutes.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start this talk by thanking Harvard Law School, Brazilian Associations, Student Association, and Rio de Janeiro Espírito Santo Federal Judges Association, and of course, thank you all very much for coming today. Well, it would be very difficult to talk about this issue after Todd, but at least I grabbed some candies for you, so maybe I can add some utility here. No. Okay, so I'll discuss this issue. Why do people not obey the law? And the first answer is because it's worth it. As Todd said, people make a fairly rational account of utility, which I would like to show you briefly. So let's imagine that someone is thinking about committing a crime or breaking a court decision, for example. Let us imagine that the personal benefit obtained with this conduct the so-called utility, could be translated in, let's say, 10 points. And let's imagine that the sanction foreseen by the perpetrator, that is, the legal consequence imposed by the law, either imprisonment or a fine in a case of a civil execution process, for example, is equal to minus 20 points. Therefore, it seems that a rational human being will not violate the law, right? Because the sanction is bigger than the benefit. But now let's imagine that the probability of punishment is around 10%. For example, the probability of being discovered, convicted, and imprisoned. Or in a case of a fine, of the value being executed efficiently by seizing the assets of the debtor. Actually, in Brazil, 10% is highly optimistic. In this case, the penalty imposed by the law, those 20 points, must be multiplied by the real probability of punishment, those 10%. And now, the expected sanction is equal to just 2 points. So now let's see the violation of the norm condition. Whenever the expected benefit exceeds the expected penalty, the law will be rationally broken. In our case, because 10 is greater than 2, the violation condition is fulfilled. So this is why, at least in a first glance, people break the law. We believe that this happens in Brazil a lot because in our country, law enforcement rates are too slow. For example, in homicides, we discovered the authorship of less than 5% of the cases. This is an official number. In tax execution suits, there are auctions in only 2% of the cases. And this is true for other type of execution suits as well. So, what's the solution? How to fix it? As Todd said, according to classical economics, you need to increase the numbers of the right side of that equation. And there are two ways to do this. The first way is increasing sanctions. And the second way is enhancing enforcement and therefore the probability of punishment. So, which one is better? The classical law in economics prefers to increase the sanctions because it's cheaper and it saves resources to use in health, education, and in other fields capable to enhance the social welfare. In our example, if we increase the sanction 5 times, then the expected sanction will be equal to the expected benefit, right? Because you have 20 points multiplied by 5, you have 100 points, times 10% chance, you have those 10 points that equal the benefit. So the marginal gain equals the marginal benefit that people will not break the law. Is it right? Yes, it is. At least for Gary Becker. But there is another view that adds cognitive biases into this equation. From the 70s, insights from psychology, mainly by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, began to update economics. Those guys challenged the rational man paradigm, realizing that our limitations of rationality, that is our biases, follow some patterns that could be predicted. And if they could be predicted, the classical models can be upgraded to a more accurate ones. And there are actually many types of biases. So let me start introducing optimism in our equation. We are all optimists. It's an evolutionary feature. Optimists live longer and are more successful. But one of the consequences of optimism is to underestimate the probability of negative events. For example, who here is a bad driver? Don't be shy. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Where is Isabella? Almost nobody. But if it was true, there would not be so many car accidents, right? So we tend to overestimate our abilities and underestimate the probability of negative events. So we need to add an optimistic discount in our example. So let's assume that instead of the real 10% chance, people reduce, because of optimism, people reduce the possibility of enforcement by a half, feeling it as if it was only 5%. So now, the benefit of break the law remains 10 points, but the expected punishment drops to just 1 point. It was 2, now it drops to just 1 point. What's the consequence? Now, more people will break the law. And people who are used to breaking the law will break the law more often. But there is yet another cognitive bias that derives from optimism, which is that people tend to ignore small probabilities. So if the actual probability is below a given number called critical threshold, it tends to be entirely ignored. So, in other words, if the actual probability of punishment is like 5%, it tends to be seen as a 0% chance for the agent when he's committing a crime. Therefore, in this case, no matter how you set the actual sanctions, the expected sanctions will always equal 0, because a number multiplied by 0 equals 0. This was proven by several kinds of research. In one, it was proven that this bias happened to people in Florida who did not buy insurance in areas with more chances of flood. Even though by the time of the research, flood insurance was highly subsidized by the federal government because they were ignoring the small probability of a negative event. This is a graph that shows how the optimistic bias operates and how people tend to ignore small probabilities. So this dotted line here depicts the real probability of a given event. It can be 50% chance, 10%, 100%, 30%, and so on. And the dark line is the discount of optimism. So if the chance is 50%, people see it like 30%, for example. Note that for the very low probabilities, it falls to 0. This is the critical threshold. So if you have 5% chance of punishment, the perpetrator will see it like zero. Zero per chance. Zero chance. But at this point, it must be said that when the event is unlikely, but very salient, the bias goes in the opposite direction. And people tend to overestimate the chance of negative events. That is why, for example, some Brazilians are afraid to go to Israel. The chance of an act of terrorism in Israel is about 1,000 times smaller than of a violent assault in Brazil. But one is afraid to leave Rio and go to Israel. But there is more. There is more. There is another cognitive bias called bounded willpower. Bounded willpower stems from a preference that we all hold for the present in detriment of the future. That is, we value the present much more than the future. Not just more, much more than the future. Therefore, the same good in the present is much more valued than in the future. For example, I have these two kinds of chocolate in my hands. On the left hand, on my left hand, I have Lindt, which is a very good brand, a delicious chocolate. In my right hand, I have a regular chocolate bar that you try to steal. Which is good, but not that good. Now let me ask you, which one do you prefer? Just think. You don't need to answer. But now I tell you, if you choose the regular bar, you can eat now. But if you choose Lindt, you need to wait until tomorrow. It's likely that this rule can change your preference, right? It's called hyperbolic discount. This is the regular bar. This is Lindt. But the regular bar is closer, so you value it more. So now you prefer the regular one. It's more desired. Actually, neuroscientists are proving this with several studies using brain imaging. They asked people what they want to eat for dessert, for example. Fruit salad or chocolate cake. And what they discovered? They discovered that people around the world prefer chocolate at higher rates when lunch is near. But they prefer fruit salad when they are asked about the next day dinner. This is hyperbolic discount again. But this is because for immediate rewards, we activate an area in our brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC, located here. This is an area that reacts automatically by impulse when our guts lie. It's an important evolutionary feature for humans and animals. We call it System 1. It's very fast. It functions like you are walking, you see a snake, and you jump. You don't think, oh, that's a snake. You just jump. It's an automatic impulse. The other way of thinking is a reflexive one. And it lies in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, located here. This is the place where lies our cognitive ability. Only humans has a system like that. We call it System 2, and it's very accurate, but very slow. And it often works anchored in the inputs of the System 1, and most of times, this mechanism works very well. But sometimes, this causes some errors in judgments. Mainly because we are no longer primates, and we don't need to live by running away from snakes every day. So now, coming back to our reality, think with me. When a robber steals a bag, his benefit is immediate. He has the bag and the values within it. And the same thing happens when someone does not pay a debt for, let's say, $10,000. She can enjoy the immediate $10,000 spending to buying something. But what about the sanction? It takes time to be enforced because in our society, we have to observe the due process, and lawsuits can take time. Imagine, for example, a country where you can only put someone in jail after 4 convictions in 4 different courts. We are discussing this issue in Brazil right now. But coming back to our example, someone has broken the law, which causes an instant benefit of 10 with a sanction of 20 with a 10% chance of punishment, right? So the expected sanction equals 2. Because this hyperbolic discount, if this sanction takes too much time to be enforced, then it will be felt as well as the expected sanction of 2 points. And I remember that in Brazil, the average time of an execution suit is about 6 years. And a criminal suit can easily exceed 10 years because we have almost 100 million of lawsuits in our judiciary system. Okay, so far we have noticed the following. Increasing sanctions is not enough. You also need to improve supervision and policy and accelerate enforcement. But there is yet another reason to not just focus on increasing the sanctions. And this is a consequence of the so-called perspective theory. According to this theory, gains and losses are felt in decreasing rates. For example, when you lose $100, the first half hurts much more than the second one. This is very clear in this classic graph by Kahneman and Tversky. Look at the pen size of the first 50. Now, look to the pen size of the second $50 lost and compare the sizes. The second one hurts less than the first one. So by this theory, if you double the actual sanction, you are less than doubling the expected sanction. So given all these observations, what are the guidelines that should be followed for punitive rules made either by legislators or judges that are capable of avoiding the commission of crimes, the disregard of judicial decisions, and the breach of contracts? First, we must invest in surveillance, increasing detection of crimes, for example. Then, the enforcement needs to be fast, and that is why it makes no sense, at least from the behavioral law and economics point of view, to wait for a Supreme Court conviction to execute a criminal sentence. So, if we achieve these two goals, the sanctions not need to be so high, but even so, they need to be fairly high, since we must consider the optimist bias in our final account. Thank you very much. So the link is for you.
Thank you, Professor Eric. We received a question here. Can I have the link for tomorrow?
Yeah, of course. This is for my good friend, Bruno.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Kit's Cat is for Isabella, who loves it.
Okay. And our next activity will be a workshop by Professor Todd, but as we're running out of time, I think it will be nice to ask Professor Todd some questions from the audience. And we have a couple of questions involving the same subject that not only you, but also Luciano talked about this. Many people complain that, or maybe they are uninformed, but they complain that law and economics lacks moral foundation. So economists have nothing to do with morality. So you couldn't use law and economics to solve problems in the legal context. How do you respond to this criticism?
Okay, so I'm not sure I know what that means. So I don't know what morality means, other than a society's views about the particular gain or benefit of particular conduct. So to say something is immoral is to conclude the answer to the question, and I'm more interested in figuring out what the question is. So I'll give you an example. Is lying good or bad? Well, when I was a kid, my parents told me that to lie is immoral. And really what they were just saying is lying is bad. Okay, so don't do it. And that's pretty good advice. But of course, there's all kinds of lying that are good. I'll give you an example. And I'll cite a very famous judge in the United States who was faced with a question about a lie and how he responded. There was a medical clinic in Chicago, and some reporters from the news went to the clinic, and they claimed to be patients. And they were lying. They were not there as patients. They brought their phones, and they recorded the conditions in the clinic. And they put a story on the news that said, this clinic is not meeting the standards of health and compliance with the rules about treating patients. And the clinic sued the reporters and said, you were trespassing. You were on our property, it was our property, and you were there without our permission. And the reporter said, well, you consented to our being there because we showed up and you said, please come in and have a seat and come back and see the rooms and so forth. And the clinic responded and said, yes, we consented, but you lied. You committed fraud. And had we known the truth, that you were here to spy on us, we would not have given you permission. Therefore, our consent was not given. Okay. How did Judge Posner decide this case in the Seventh Circuit, the Court of Appeals in Chicago? He said the parties brought in legal doctrine. This is fraud. This is not fraud. And he said, this is all just silly. Like saying it's immoral or it's not immoral. He said, of course this is a lie. Of course they committed fraud. Of course it was immoral in some sense to lie. But the question is, was the lie a good lie or a bad lie? And here, it's a good lie. And the reason it's a good lie is because, think of it from the perspective of a clinic that is a good clinic. Imagine there are good clinics and bad clinics. And you asked good clinics, do you want reporters to lie to you? Do you want reporters to come and enter your clinic on false pretenses, committing a lie to do a story behind the scenes? And of course, the good clinic says yes, because they will show that we're a good clinic and that clinic is a bad clinic, and that clinic will be put out of business and people will rely more on doctors and the cost of healthcare will be lower. And so, of course, as a society, we want to encourage this kind of fraud because it has good social consequences. The net effect of allowing this lie, this trespass, this act that people might call immoral, results in a society that is better. Better clinics, better efficiency for better public transparency about potential wrongdoing. That is a socially beneficial lie. So my answer to the question of like, is it immoral or not, is I don't know what content morality has. I'm interested in what are the rules that make society better off. We could get those answers by looking to what Aristotle wrote or Rousseau or whomever, great thinkers, and say, well, they've just imagined things. Well, this is fine. That might help us answer the question, but it is not the final answer to the question. The final answer to the question is thinking through what the effects of punishing certain conduct is and whether those will be good for society. That's how I would think about it. So it's not that morality is irrelevant, but morality is just kind of a too quick shortcut to what you think the answer should be without actually really thinking through it.
Yes. And maybe abusing here again of my powers as a moderator.
You have been a dictator. You are in a position of a dictatorship.
I'd like to, just to elaborate on this question. How do you solve problems like abortion or like same-sex marriage using the tools of law and economics?
I'm not sure that, there are certain questions where there will be political judgments that are kind of outside of economic thinking. I think an economist could tell you, like Luciano's presentation, if you lower the cost of abortion, we will get more abortions. And if you lower the cost of same-sex marriage, and when I mean cost, I mean if you make it socially acceptable for people of the same sex to be married, you've lowered the cost because people now will be able to be public about their marriage. Maybe they would have a relationship that was secret or something like that. So if you lower the cost, you will have more of them. Okay? I think then the question for policymakers is, what are the values of the policymakers? Is that something that we want to encourage or not? And for something like abortion, economists in the United States have looked at the abortion question and said, well, there are unwanted pregnancies. Those unwanted pregnancies result in children who are raised in families that are not where they're not wanted. Maybe the parents can't afford them, and linked the access to abortion to lower crime rates, for instance. So that is this kind of thing that economists could do with the abortion question. But I don't think law and economics has the answer to the abortion question, because you might just say, look, even if it's inefficient, even if society is going to be worse off in these ways from having abortion, from permitting abortions, we don't want to have it because we're sending some kind of signal about the society we are or something. So I'm not sure that, at least I wouldn't think about something like abortion in that consequence, because people have views about life that are not reducible to those sort of numerical equations. But I think economic ideas can inform an assessment of what the costs and benefits of a particular law would be. But it's certainly the case that the society can populate people's utility functions and try to change them. And that might be something that abortion law, let's say, or gay marriage, it's not just accepting people's utility curves, it's trying to change them. So a good example of this would be racial discrimination. People might have a preference for race discrimination. I might prefer my own race. And so in my utility function that Eric talked about, I put in there more, like if I interact with someone who's Caucasian like I am, I get more utility. And a policymaker who looked at just my utility function and accepted it as it was might allow me to engage in race discrimination because I like interacting with people of the same race more than different races. But that utility function, the society might say, we don't like that utility function. We would like to change it by making race discrimination illegal as a means of moving people from one kind of thinking to another kind of thinking. And that, I think, is completely acceptable.
May I add something?
Yeah.
Please.
Maybe one hint to what is behind the question is, Todd, we have been fighting a kind of old debate in Brazil about the famous 70s discussion between Posner and Dworkin. Even though Posner had changed his mind at least 2 times after that debate. So the critics of law and economics normally comes from a moral perspective, but the problem of this is if we consider economics as a science, as it is, of course you can analyze morally the science, but is physics as a science morally right or wrong? When Einstein created his theories, and then his theories help us to understand the world as well as create a nuclear bomb, was that morally right? When biology create human reproduction, is it right? So science is neutral in terms of morality. Morality is another field. It belongs to philosophy. And of course, we can discuss the philosophy of economics. But then, of course, you'll find a lot of philosophers who would sustain, because that's the, they are utilitarians. They are, there are much more of philosophy behind than utilitarianism. You can use pragmatism. You can use like McCormick, that was quoted actually by a Supreme Court Justice last week, that you can use consequence to part of the judicial thinking. So, but it's not the question. I think we can analyze things from a philosophical point of view, but you cannot criticize science only by morals. You have to assess science by its results of giving prediction about future behavior. And I think that's what's... sometimes I refuse that question, says, what would law and economics would say about that in terms of as a recipe? And I don't think there's a recipe. I think there's only indications which path I would like to follow, and then there's a political deliberation, which path. For those who teach or practice family law, for instance, after Brazil had a divorce law, the number of divorce increased, like 40%. Is it good or bad? Then we can do a sort of moral assessment from that. And it is not right or wrong, the moral assessment. It's a moral thing. But we can assess that after the passing of the law, there was a result. Maybe good, maybe bad. Because we don't clarify homicides in Brazil, there's a lot of homicides. And that's, I think this is good, this is bad, this is moral, but we cannot hide, in a way, what what economics is predicting. That's what I.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I think that when you are discussing these hard cases, like abortion, for example, you are not discussing anything. You are just trying to convince the other one about our reflections. And it's very usual that people try to use rights as a shield for their own thinking, their own conviction. And rights functions as a shortcut about what I think about abortion or questions involve gender or other things. So we tend to discuss these issues with our system one that functions automatically and not looking at the consequence. This is a pragmatic view.
Yeah, I'll add to that. So to what Luciano said, the economic analysis is just an input into a moral or political question. So if you ask me what is the consequence of a law that makes abortions illegal, I can predict what that's going to be, and then we can discuss politically whether that's a good thing or bad thing. So it's an input, it's not an output. To your point about rights, this is something that I spend a lot of time with our first-year law students trying to convince them that rights really don't do anything either. Of course, we start with some simple premises like, I have the right to bodily autonomy. That is, you can't touch me without my permission. But that even is a little bit too naive, because you can imagine situations in which the cost for, if Eric strikes me, it's a pretty easy case. He hits me and I'm harmed, he should have to pay for my damage. That's a rights-based thinking. I have the right to him not to hit me. But that's not a good way to think about the problem, because the social rule wants to prevent the accident, that is, I'm hit without my permission and I'm harmed, but it might be that I'm a cheaper or more efficient person to avoid the harm. So imagine I have and this is a very famous case, imagine I have a defect in my leg where I'm very sensitive to any touching. And if he touches me, I might have some very bad damage in my leg. And my leg is under the table here, and Eric kicks me, and I suffer the damage. Who is the person that is responsible? Sure, I have a right not to be kicked, but maybe I could have avoided this problem much more easily than he could. I could have told him, I have a very bad leg, please don't kick me. I could have worn some protection on my body, a shield to prevent my leg being damaged. I might have been the cheaper avoider of this accident. And in that case, if it is the case that I am the cheaper avoider of the accident, then saying that I have the right to not be touched, and that being the end of the question, would mean we would end up with a less efficient outcome. I would be the cheaper avoider, and yet he would be the one that would be responsible for avoiding it. If instead of thinking about rights, we ask the question, how can we solve this problem at the lowest possible cost? It is a problem. My leg is damaged. What is the way to create a rule to avoid that in the most efficient way, the cheapest way, the expenditure of the least social resources to get the good result? It might be that it's on me to do that. Now, as a society, you could imagine inputs into that question about the cheapest that are not just about money. So just to give you an example, imagine that I have a very thin skull. Some people are born with very thin skulls, and if you hit them in the head, they will die. If I know that I have a thin skull, one solution would be for me to wear a helmet. Everywhere I go, I have a big helmet on my head. Well, that would be very awkward for me. I would be stigmatized. Everyone would look at me and think, this is some kind of a freak that he's wearing this big giant helmet. I mean, I'm already kind of a freak. I'm 2 meters and bald, but I would be even more of a freak. And so society might say, yes, it would be better in dollar terms. It would be cheaper if you wore this helmet, but you would be stigmatized. And that is not a society we want to live in. And so we would put a value on stigmatization that is very high. And then the rule would be, if Eric hits me in the head and kills me, he has to pay. Even if I have a thin skull, and even if I knew I had a thin skull, and that is the rule in the United States. If you take your victim as you find them, if you hit them in the head and they have a very thin skull, you have to pay, even though it might be cheaper to have the helmet. And I think the reason is because of this stigma. We don't want people going around with big, giant helmets, even if it would be cheaper. So that's a good example of how law and economics can load up the question with something that's not just about money, but is thinking about social efficiency in a very broad way.
So we still have time for one more question. There's one about the expected punishment. So both Professor Todd and Professor Eric talked about the need to adjust the expected punishment, not only the punishment, but also the probability of detection to be compatible with the expected benefit from the harm we are trying to prevent. But there's a commonplace in Brazil that if we raise the punishment, we'll put more people in jail, and then we'll increase the prison population. So there's a very famous movie in Brazil. I don't know if Professor Todd is familiar with it, but in my view is the greatest movie from Brazil from all times, which is Tropa de Elite.
Yeah.
In which there's a professor of history saying, well, now we have a population in prison of X. Then, in 2025, the entire population of Brazil will be in jail. This will be the consequence. So how do you answer this question? We have to adjust the expected punishment, but if we raise the punishment, we have a big social waste of getting people in jail.
Well, so I think Eric's supplement to what I was saying was right on target in saying there's two ways that you can do this. You could talk about enforcement. If you catch all the criminals, then punishments need to be very, very low. And so you could let a lot of people out of jail. That's one thing. So I think he's right on that. A second thing is society can try to influence people's curves. So he mentioned this, do I want a candy bar today or tomorrow? People and societies have what's called a discount rate. How much do I discount what's in the future? If you say to me, I'll give you $100 today, or I'll give you $100 10 years from now, the $100 in 10 years is worth not very much. But if I have a very high discount rate, I will think, well, 10 years, I might be dead. It's worth zero to me. Whereas someone with a very low discount rate thinks about the future and plans for the future. There's the old fairy tale about the grasshopper and the ant, and the person who prepares for the future and the person who just thinks about today. I think one issue with criminals in my country, I don't know Brazil as well, there are big segments of the population who feel like they have no future. And if you feel like you have no future, you're not going to be alive when you're 40 years old. Why would I care about a 30-year prison sentence? I'm not going to be alive. And so if you have a very low discount rate, you will engage in a lot more crime because you're going to be more self-centered. You're not going to be making investments in human capital. So society can try to change people's discount rates by giving them a future. That means giving them an education. That means giving them a safe place to grow up. That means giving them clean water. All these things that can take people's curve, that hyperbolic discounting curve, and flatten it out, right? Not a surprise that in Sweden, people have to invest for the future because if you don't, you're going to freeze to death. Whereas, if you're living in the jungle somewhere and you can just walk and pick a mango, you don't have to think so much or plan for the future. That's a problem, and societies need to shift people's discount rates. I think another thing is we could be much more innovative about the kind of punishments that we use. There are lots of people in jails in the United States who are there for crimes that are not really crimes, in my view. I mean, I see this sign up here that says cannabis legalization. There are lots of people. There are lots of people in jail in my country for doing things that are illegal for moral reasons that should not be illegal, in my view. So I'd be happy with letting most of the criminals out, especially for drug crimes. That's my own political view. But we don't really have lots of innovations about punishment because we're kind of squeamish. We could use a lot more systems of monitoring people and using alternative kinds of punishment that would reduce the prison population. Unfortunately, in my country, there's a big lobby for prisons, which are politicians who can easily convince their constituents that they're tough on crime by putting people in jail. It's a very low-cost way for politicians to win political support. And then, of course, the people who run the prisons, the government officials, the private companies, the labor unions who employ the prison guards, they have no interest in letting people out of jail. So there's a kind of political story as well. So enforcement, get rid of morality and law, and think about the social cost, let a lot of people out of jail. And I think breaking the political cycle of politics and prisons is probably a good first step. But I don't know what Eric thinks.
Of course, I'm not an expert in criminal law, but of course in Brazil the situation is the opposite because it's not privatized, so there is no such a system of course politicians might claim to for that agenda, but the incentives are not exactly the same way. And when we see the number, of course we can say Brazil would have the largest or the fourth largest incarcerated population, but then we also have to control the size of the population, the number of crimes, and that what comes. Of course you can solve, it's very hard to solve the problem giving people more education, because those people who are committing crimes nowadays, they will not benefit at all from that investment. So there's a real issue to be addressed in Brazil. And of course, we have criminal attorneys here that, of course, would not enter into an agreement with me because they tend to see liberty as a real value. The problem is to consider that value in balance with the society suffering from crimes. And it's not by accident, and numbers could give us some hint. If you look at the number of, use the word, when we discovered the criminal esclarecimento, the taxa de esclarecimento of, which is of clarifying crimes, in São Paulo is 30 or 40%. And there's much more people in jail if you compare with Rio, which is 6. And of course, for a law and economics scholar, we shouldn't be surprised that in Rio there's more homicide. It's predictable, quietly predictable.
Yeah, I mean, in New York City, for instance, there was a huge crime problem in the 1970s, and the government took Eric's advice, and they really increased enforcement. They increased enforcement, interestingly, in very low-level crimes. So, of course, they were interested in deterring homicides, but they started arresting people for doing things that were very petty, like not paying for the subway, graffiti, these kinds of things. And the social signal was, there were two things. One is, it was a very salient way of showing we're being tough on crime. We're not going to tolerate crime anymore. And also getting people when they were young, because people learn these formulas and they learn about the costs and benefits of crime. And if you get someone when they're 14 years old and you say to them, like, we're watching you and we're going to arrest you and we're going to make you experience this punishment, they learn like 14-year-olds learn anything. They learn to be socialized, And socializing them at that stage on these very sort of petty crimes actually turned out to be a very effective strategy. So the murder rate in New York City is now, practically zero from a time when I was there, when I was a kid in the 1970s, and you were afraid to walk around on the streets. And the approach was very systematic in raising enforcement. Our society is a little bit further ahead in this regard. We're now in the backlash period.
Yes.
And the backlash period is, well, you're picking on people because of their race. And as it turns out, African Americans in America commit way more crimes. So if you look at the police searching people in New York City and getting illegal weapons, they're pulling over mostly people who are black. Those people are committing most of the crimes. Now, that's a very complicated social question, but we're now seeing a pushback against this aggressive policing, and I think we're probably going to see an increase in crime as a result, just as law and economics would predict. Now, it may be that the society says the racial costs of policing are too high. We will tolerate more violence on the streets to satisfy this preference for not picking people based on their race. Okay, that's a question for the society to decide on. The person who does law and economics will merely tell you, if you do that, you're going to see more crime, for the reasons that Eric and Luciano gave.
Todd, please put your headphones. I will try
Yes,
to
please.
speak it in Portuguese because
Yes.
it will be very difficult. Há professor aqui em Harvard chamado Steven Pinker. Ele talvez seja hoje um dos principais neurocientistas e filósofos do mundo. E ele diz que a nossa mente ela tende a pensar em termos de concretude. Então a gente fica mortificado quando a gente individualiza o sofrimento e olha para alguém que está sofrendo. É o nosso sistema 1 funcionando. E a gente não consegue medir a importância social daquilo que eu chamo de sofrimento do ser humano estatístico. Então, quando eu prendo alguém e essa pessoa aparece na televisão, naquelas imagens horríveis que a polícia às vezes faz, de botar os caras ali todos presos, virados para a parede e tal. Tem gente até que gosta disso, mas a maioria não gosta. Eu não observo o ser humano, a quantidade de seres humanos estatisticamente sendo protegidas ou salvas de crimes que poderiam ter sido cometidos e que não foram cometidos. Agora, claro, existe um período de transição, como ele mesmo disse. Todo mundo fala que os Estados Unidos têm altas taxas de encarceramento. Só que as taxas de criminalidade baixaram astronomicamente do final dos anos 90 para cá. E agora eles estão no backlash. Realmente estão tendo que olhar para... Mas aí já é um ajuste fino que eles estão fazendo. Né? Nós estamos na pré-história. O Brasil vive na barbárie, com todo respeito. E quem está dizendo isso não sou eu. O Claude Lévi-Strauss, quando esteve no Brasil, lá na década de 70, ele disse: nós vamos passar da selvageria à decadência sem passar pela civilização. Então é isso que está acontecendo hoje com o Brasil. E eu acho que essa coisa de lembrar que o nosso cérebro avalia a importância das coisas em termos de concretude e não em termos estatísticos é importante para endereçar essa questão também.
As
Can I make
Professor,
one quick comment to that?
Yes.
First of all, the translator is amazing. So, great job. Eric said something very important, and I just want to reference somebody that you might want to read. It's a French economist by the name of Bastiat, Bastiat, and he called this problem the seen and the unseen problem. The seen, the people we see in a courtroom, a victim who's been harmed, and of course all of us have human empathy. We want to satisfy that person. And Bastiat said, that is fine for a judge to look at the human in the courtroom and think about their humanity and their suffering, their rights, etc. But the really good judge thinks about the unseen, the person who's not in the courtroom, the person in his mind, the criminals in the courtroom, and we see them and we think about them. And it's not just their victim, who may also be in the courtroom, or maybe their family's there, but all the other people who will be influenced by the legal rule in this case. We let this person go. We are not only releasing them, we're sending a message to other criminals about the cost of criminality. And then there are all the families who will be harmed by those criminals. That's the unseen. So good judges think about the statistical, the seen and the unseen, the totality of their rules, and they're not just overwhelmed by the emotion and empathy of the case before them.
I may just
We're running out of time because Professor Gordon Reed is already here.
Okay.
So I'd like to ask a round of applause to our panelists today.